Thank you for joining me today. My name is Sam. You can find me and more of my videos at affairrecovery.com or by searching on YouTube under Samuel Infidelity. Today, we are so thankful to have the esteemed Dr. Robert Weiss with us today. You know me, if you've seen any of my videos, when I'm sitting in a chair, I'm typically doing an interview. And so let me read you the bio for Dr. Rob Weiss. He is the Chief Clinical Officer of Seeking Integrity, LLC, offering clinical programs that provide online education and residential treatment for sex, porn, and substance or sex-addicted men and their families. A psychotherapist and addiction specialist with 6 intimacy and addiction treatment programs in the United States, Southeast Asia, and the U.S. military. Dr. Weiss is an online host for digital addiction on A&E. He has served as a subject matter expert for major media outlets including CNN, NPR, and the New York Times, among others. He is the author of 11 books, including Prodependence, Sex Addiction 101, and Out of the Doghouse. He has a Psychology Today blog called Love and Sex in the Digital Age and has had over 21 million readers. While his podcast, Sex, Love, and Addiction, has generated over 1 million downloads since its inception. We are so thankful to spend time with Dr. Rob Weiss today. Dr. Rob, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, I'm glad to be here.
So I want to start, you wrote a book that's phenomenal called Prodependence. So for my audience that maybe hasn't grown too familiar, or maybe they are, why don't you give us an idea of what prodependence is and where it came from?
Well, I've been working in the field of addiction for, about 30 years. I'm an addict myself. And I also have had addicted family members. And to be honest with you, on a bunch of levels, both with patients and family, I've never felt comfortable nor have ever liked the model of codependency. I don't believe that when people are hurting and struggling with someone that they love who is failing, that it's the time to go to them and say, well, now that we are understanding your partner's addiction or your family member's addiction, let's talk about your problems. I
Right.
can't think of anything worse than someone having struggled with someone who's alcoholic or a drug addict or a sex addict, and they finally got them to treatment or they finally got them some help and they're just beginning to feel hopeful and they're going to get validated, and then they're told what they did wrong. And I just don't
Right.
think that is effective.
I couldn't agree with you more. And so many in our community, the betrayed spouses feel like they're brought into a situation where they're slammed with these names like codependency and you're just codependent. I mean, talk a little bit about that, because what's a betrayed spouse to do when they're put in a position where maybe their spouse or their partner is maybe they're an addict, or maybe they've just had one or maybe multiple affairs, but what does that do to the betrayed to even shame them in the middle of their pain?
Well, my focus is any partner or family member of any addict. And the idea of prodependence came from the sex addiction community because, when you're the spouse or when you're a betrayed partner, there really isn't anything that you could possibly do yourself to make someone you love act out with sex workers and affairs. And, this is one of the common misperceptions that I think codependency encourage, which I really discourage, is this idea that there's anything that I could do as a family member or a loved one that could make someone else act out or use. If you're having a bad day and you're mad at me and you think I'm fat and ugly and terrible and I'm not having enough sex with you, you can go for a walk. You can divorce me. You can buy something expensive. You do not have to go out and have sex with other people or drink. That is not the logical conclusion of my unhappiness. That is a choice. So one of the things I think it's really important that I talk about in Prodependence is nobody can make somebody else use or act out. You can make someone miserable, but their decision to use or act out is theirs and theirs alone. Unfortunately, addicts like to say, well, if he were just more this and if she were just more that, I wouldn't do this. And, that's an addict trying to externalize their problem. But the reality is that there is no responsibility whatsoever, zero, on partners and loved ones for causing or even escalating the problem of addiction in another person. And to imply that is to put some of the responsibility of the addiction on the family member or the spouse, which I think is abusive. If I was a loved one of an addict or even sex porn, whatever it is, when I finally got my partner some help or was coming to terms with what I was living with, I would want you to come to me and say, wow, I'm so impressed with how strong you are, that you stayed with this addict despite all of these challenges, how much love you must have in your heart for trying to keep your family together. I don't understand the concept of codependency. And it kind of says to people, well, you didn't take care of that addict right. You did it wrong. And let's teach you how to do it right. As if anybody who went to high school or college studied how to work with an addict. You
Right.
married an addict, you got involved with an addict. That doesn't mean you know how to help them. And when you go out of your way and maybe you end up nagging and complaining and yelling and screaming, who knows? You become someone you don't want to be when you're,
Right.
spouse of an addict. But that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. That means you're in a crisis. So this years and years of looking at partners and loved ones of addicts as having something wrong with them has completely missed the mark. Prodependence says, and I really believe this, that it's not that I'm contributing to the problem of addiction, it's that I'm affected by the problem of addiction. And if you look at me as a crazy person, because I'm a partner and a spouse and I'm acting crazy, that's because my craziness was caused by living with an addict, not that I am contributing to the addiction. And I think that's really been a painful reality that a loved one has had to accept, which is just simply not true. That somehow there's something wrong with them or they're driving the addiction or, that's not helpful for anybody.
I think it's brilliant that you can tap into how the betrayed can feel so much shame from even professionals who will label them with this tag of codependency. And now they've gone from, okay, my partner's in crisis and I'm in crisis, but now they live with the idea that they've been doing something wrong and that something's wrong with them for trying to stay with their unfaithful partner. Now, my question though is there a time where you would tell this betrayed partner, okay, look, enough is enough. Like, you can't keep subjecting yourself to the abuse that you are being subjected to?
Well, I think there are a lot of levels of that. Certainly, if there's physical abuse or violence, if children are coming to harm, if someone is so emotionally distraught and unable to function because of the situation they're in, you need to take care of yourself and get the heck out of there. There's nothing
Right.
in prodependence that says to stay in an unsustainable, abusive relationship. All I'm saying is that I'm not going to blame you for loving a troubled person. A lot of this, Sam, comes back to when I think about medical issues. If my partner had cancer and I gave up my job and I read every single book and I became a detective about cancer and I started nagging them to go to the doctor and to do this and not do that. And I was watching them and every minute and I gave up exercise and I gave up my own, pleasures and I gained weight and I was miserable because I was living with that problem. You wouldn't say to me, oh, wow, well, you're really troubled for hanging in there with someone who has cancer. You need to detach or work on
Right.
yourself. They would say
Right.
to me, you are our hero. I'm going to bring you casseroles and give you a night off because what family that's been victimized by cancer would blame or devalue any family member who did everything they could, right or wrong, good or bad, to support that person they love and the family that they love who's been affected by cancer? But when a family is affected by addiction, and I'm acting, I put my whole heart into it and I give up my activities and I start yelling and screaming and I gain weight and I become someone I never wanted to be. Why would you say there's something wrong with me? Why, in that situation with addiction, when someone is ill, do we blame a partner or a spouse? When in addiction, where someone is physically ill, we celebrate them. And that's because codependency has been around for such a long time that it's sort of considered a fact.
Yeah.
And Sam, I have to say, well, you don't know this. I did my dissertation, my PhD dissertation on the topic of codependence. I read
Mm.
well, I didn't read every book because there are 427 of them, but I read a whole bunch of books. I read the history. I read, all about codependence. And, here's the bottom line from a therapist perspective. There's no diagnosis. It's never been a diagnosis. There's no universal criteria or method for me to say you're codependent, and let me explain that. If you're depressed, I have diagnostic books and I can say, oh, they have these four things, they're depressed. And if you're in New York and I'm in Ohio, and I say to you, my client is depressed, you know what that means because you have these four things and you know what depression is because we agree on that. But codependency, because it has never been a diagnosis, does not have any universal method by which we say, oh, that's codependency. Which means if I'm in New York and you're in Ohio and we both say, oh, that client's codependent, what does that mean? We have
Yeah.
427 books on the topic of codependency, which is the right one. And what
Right.
always really bugs me is what are we teaching our students in the addictions who are working with sex and love addiction and all of that? What are we telling them about this? Because there is no standard for what codependency is. It's an idea, it's a concept, but it's not actually a thing. It's not accepted, it's not validated, it doesn't have research behind it. Essentially, codependency is a pop culture idea that bled into the therapy field and now sits around in one place and one place only, and that's an addiction.
And I was watching an interview that you did quite some time ago. I thought it was fantastic. But in it, and also in your book, you talk about the concept interdependence, which I think is so key when you're dealing with addicts, but it's also helpful for the betrayed. They trying to navigate through, well, what if I'm not codependent, and if I can administer maybe some tough love, or if maybe I'm going to ride this out with my partner or my spouse. You had mentioned interdependence as a bit of a goal. So what does that look like?
Well, part of the problem with codependency, and it comes out of the times that codependency was came to birth, which is really during the feminism of the 70s. There was this idea that that in order for me to succeed as a woman, I need to detach, I need to go out there on my own, I need to push aside empathy, compassion, and I need to get out there and be aggressive like men. And that was the only way that women were seen to be able to break the glass ceiling. I think of 9 to 5, women who were fighting this stupid boss to get ahead and trying to shove him out of the way. Well, that was a great concept and idea at that time for women to fight their way through the glass ceiling in the workplace and in the world. Not so good for relationships, because
Mm.
in relationship dependency, it's a good thing. I want to depend on the people I love. The world out there is a tough place. And
Right,
I want to value my dependency. So interdependency means that I don't have to be a perfect person and you're a perfect person, and together we're two perfect people. Interdependency means where I am vulnerable and I have challenges, you can come in and be the strong one. And where you have vulnerabilities and you have challenges, because I love you and care about you, I will come in and be the strong one. So that kind of merger, that kind of interdependent support, that's what a healthy relationship is. And automatically over time, you become more dependent on each other because you feel more safe and more connected. And that is the goal of healthy dependency. I want people to be dependent, not on unhealthy circumstances, but in situations where their needs are met, where there is a real intimacy being built by leaning on each other. If you look at who we are as people, look at the research, none of us were meant to be alone. We
true.
do best and we seek out dependent communities and dependent individual relationships to be stronger. Sam, I learned probably about 10 years into my sex and love addiction recovery that I'd been running away from the most important thing in my life, which was the foundation of my home and my friendships and my primary relationship. I was so busy looking for something out there that I didn't realize that the thing that was absolutely going to be the most supportive to me was right here. And of course, I learned that, growing up in a crazy family and trying to run away
Right,
as quickly as I could.
right.
So let me just say one more thing about this whole idea of codependency. I'm not saying that everyone who's involved in the addict gets it right. We
Sure,
do become
sure.
people who might yell or scream or become someone I often hear from partners, especially partners of sex and love addicts. I've become someone I don't want to be,
Yeah,
and I'm nagging and I'm this and I'm that. And part of that, my response to that is, well, who wouldn't act that way if they were in a crisis? If your
right,
kid was, God forbid, hit by a truck, you wouldn't be sleeping, you would gain weight, you'd be worried all the time, you'd be yelling, you'd be screaming, you'd be a mess because you're in crisis. And it's
right.
no different than when someone you love is failing and you can't make them better. You're going to maybe look like a crazy person just trying to get this person you love better, just trying to restore your family to health. And that
Yeah,
is the goal of every partner, I believe. And so, what we call the craziness of codependency, okay, maybe I didn't do the most helpful thing when I yelled at you last night, but that doesn't mean there's something wrong with me. That means I don't have the most effective way of making this different. And I think that's what therapy with spouses and partners is for, not only to support you, to nurture you, and to help you work through betrayal, which is a whole field of work within itself, but also to help you understand that you did the best you could. And that even if you became someone you didn't want to be, well, who wouldn't? You're living in crazy circumstances. How could you take an addict, a partner of a loved one who's been betrayed, into your therapy office and start blaming them and devaluing them and questioning for their issues when
Oh
look
God,
what they've been
yes.
living with?
Right. No, you're exactly right. I mean, we could do a whole interview just on what you just said and how these betrayeds are so shamed. But you said something in an interview that I thought was brilliant. I can't remember when it was, but I was watching it last night.
Oh, I'm really glad it was brilliant.
And you had said something to, there was this couple on TV, and there was the addict, and then the spouse of the addict, and the addict got really angry, really upset, and you called him out on TV and you said, look, you're wanting your betrayed partner to rescue you right now, and she is not able to rescue you. I see so many unfaithful who have this demeanor, this attitude that they feel they should be catered to and rescued by their betrayed partner, because then they want to blame their betrayed partner that you made me do this. I mean, what do you tell people in that moment? And would you agree that it is borderline an epidemic that the unfaithful or even the addict has this mentality that they should be rescued in their addiction or acting out?
Well, I think entitlement is what leads to addiction, and it's what maintains addiction. So
Mm,
if you're so make me so unhappy, we're not having sex, or you don't look the way you used to, or you're all focused on the family and the kids and I'm not getting what I need, or I'm working all the time and supporting this family, those kind of resentments are going to lead me to justify my betrayals and my acting out by blaming you. It's so much easier for me to say you make me so unhappy that I have to go do this,
right.
than to say, you know what, I made a decision to go do this. In other words, for an addict to put responsibility on a spouse is to duck under their own responsibility. And by the way, that's a form of denial. Because if
Hmm.
I can blame you, then I don't have to take responsibility for my own behavior. Um, I don't know what I did so brilliantly.
I love the fact that you were able to graciously, because at the end of the day, shame-based professional care never works. I mean, you're an expert in that. But the fact that unfaithfuls or addicts can be called out to say, look, you made your choice. And as long as you keep blaming everybody else, you're never going to be safe. You're never going to be healthy. Am I right?
Well, first of all, I often use the story of the non-alcoholic who gets drunk at a party and decides to drive home, and he gets pulled over by the cops, and the first thing he says is, "Well, I shouldn't have done this. What was I thinking? I should have gotten an Uber. I should have," because he takes responsibility for the problem, and therefore he makes better decisions the next time. The alcoholic gets drunk at the party, drives home, and when he gets pulled over, he says, "Boy, the police in this neighborhood, and gosh, you shouldn't be driving a red car, and I should have left earlier or taken a different route." In other words, the problem is outside of them. And as long as you can excuse your acting out, your cheating, your addictive behavior on another situation, you don't have to be responsible for yourself. And in sex and betrayal situations, people, I've been married 21 years. My spouse does not look the way they did 21 years ago. To put that expectation out that you should look like the people in the porn, or you should look like you used to, or you're not hot anymore, or whatever that is to not only accept the intimacy and love of aging, but it's to have an excuse to blame someone to validate what I'm going to go do. And I have to tell you, and I really want everybody to hear this, whoever's listening. I work with spouses and couples all the time. And the first thing I say when I'm working with a couple is I say to the spouse, I want you to write this down. Sometimes they put it on a pad, sometimes they write it down. But there's three things I tell them, whether there's an addiction, betrayal, whatever. And I want every spouse who's listening to hear this. Write it down. Number one, you have never been. Number two, you are not now. And number three, you never will be. You have never been, you are not now, and you never will be responsible for someone else's acting out, ever. And
Mm.
no matter what they say or what they do, don't take that on. And Sam, when people are living with an addict or they've been betrayed, they're in grief, right? And grief, we know a lot about grief. It's anger and bargaining and it's, despair and all that stuff. But one of the things that was not talked about when we learned about grief is the issue of remorse. And when
Hmm.
my dog died, I think, wow, I wished I walked him more. I wish I'd spent more time with him. I wish I'd played with him. When my father passed away, I said, I wish we'd had that conversation. I wish that longing to make things different, that remorse is a part of grieving. It's normal and natural. But codependency and this whole attitude of you're responsible for part of my problem is to distort grief, because I already feel like, gosh, if I'd been thinner or more this or more that, you wouldn't have done that, because I'm so hurting about what you've done. I'm so trying to come to sense with it, and I'm dealing with my grief. I'm looking for reasons, and everyone will say, what did I do wrong that this has happened? And what codependency does, unfortunately, is say it comes in and says, well, let me tell you what you did wrong. You're to
Right.
this, and you're to that, and you grew up with this, and you grew up with that. And that's to take advantage of someone's grief rather than supporting them through their grief, which is prodependence and what that's about.
I think there's so much in what you said that I love. And you had said this earlier, is that particularly betrayed partners will maybe even say to you, I've become a person I've never wanted to be. But I think an addict who is sobering up, who is grounding out, right, who is hitting ground zero and they're bottoming out and they're maybe coming to an awareness of who they are, would say the same thing. I became a person I never wanted to be. When people come and they're vulnerable with you and they're laying their life on the table, their addictions or their crisis, their trauma, I mean, you're an expert. What do you tell them when they say, man, I don't even know who I am anymore? And that goes for betrayeds as well. They just hit that point where they're so caught, they're almost delirious in pain and chaos and confusion. What do you tell them when they're in that position?
Well, I think, part of the answer is that addicts or people who are betraying, cheaters, if you will, and partners, they have a different path for healing.
Yeah.
Codependency kind of implies, well, you're addicted to your spouse. I don't think partners have an addiction, or if they do, it has nothing to do with their relationships. They may have their own alcohol problem or whatever, but I'm not addicted to my spouse. I am obsessed with the problem. And when I become obsessed with a problem that I can't fix in someone I love, it is overwhelming. And yes,
Hmm.
I stop taking care of myself in order to focus on the problem. So, absolutely, just like codependence. Prodependence would say, focus on yourself, get support, nurture yourself, detach some from the situation so you can take better care of yourself. Don't detach so that you can become achieving and self actualized. And, just so my focus with partners is self care and self nurturing so that they can recover from the crisis of what they've been through. I believe that finding out that a loved one has been cheating on you, that is drinking, that they're out of control, is a form of tremendous loss. And there you are trying to make it better, trying to pull your family together, can't do it, it's overwhelming. You need a lot of support and nurturing in order to help you tolerate and manage this very difficult situation. Not because there's something wrong with you, but because you've been in a situation that would overwhelm anyone. And now you need a tremendous amount of support. What I say to the addict or the cheater is, you have work to do because you're looking at the world in a very distorted way. We need to clean up those distortions. We need to help you feel badly about what you've done wrong. We need you to reconnect with a new way of living, and you got to get to work. And you're probably going to be doing this the rest of your life, meetings, groups, all that kind of stuff. So what I say to these folks is, your path is very different. And by the way, in early recovery from cheating, betrayal, whatever, partners this is one of the times they really can't lean on each other. Because what a spouse and a partner needs is support and nurturing and kindness. They don't need to be confronted. They don't need to be told they're doing anything wrong. They maybe need to be redirected on how they can do things more effectively, but they don't need to be blamed and shamed and challenged. But addicts, they do need to be challenged and put in the hot seat and given direction. So, what I'm saying to these folks is, you can't turn to each other, because a spouse, you're angry at him or her, and you can't help someone you're angry at. An addict, all you want is forgiveness. And that's not what this person should be doing at this point. So dependency is something that they really need to turn away from for part of their healing process, because there's not a whole lot you can do when two people are so escalated and so upset. But then once the healing has begun for both partners, then they can turn to each other and say, how can we improve what we have had? Um, and I don't know if that's helpful to say, but I'm giving these people different directions because the partners need to find peace in their lives, something they haven't had in a very long time. And addicts
Absolutely.
need a lot of disruption to something
Yeah,
some agenda they've set that they think is tolerable.
I agree with you. I think so much of what you said was very pointed, but yet compassionate. And I think without a compassionate approach, people start to turn away. But with just compassion, we can, in many ways, just fuel the disinterest and the laziness. So, as we kind of end today, how can people find you and your website? Tell them how they can find you and learn more about both Prodependence as well as your website.
Well, uh, wow, that's a long question. I run a treatment center called Seeking Integrity here in California. We treat men who have problems with sex addiction or sex and drug addiction. That's all I do. That's what I've done for 30 years. So if you want to find me, you can find me at seekingintegrity.com. But, really go to Amazon and type in my name and you will find the 9 or 10 books that I've written. You can look up my name and the word sex or betrayal. I don't know if I told you this, I'm going to like brag on myself a little bit. We just passed 1 million downloads on our podcast. So
Mm.
sex, love, and addiction, 1 million podcasts. I have a Psychology Today blog called Sex and Love in the Digital Age. We just passed 8 million downloads. So people are hungry to learn about cheating and infidelity and healing. And really, you can find me pretty much anywhere. If you want to write me, you can write me at rob@seekingintegrity.com. I'm always glad to get a note and return it with whatever way I can. I do quickly want to say, Sam, that Prodependence is out there in 2 different ways. There is a version for therapists, so this to teach them how to move beyond the model of codependency into prodependence, and that's called Practicing Prodependence. And then there's a book for the rest of us who just want to understand it called Prodependence. What is it called? Prodependence, Moving Beyond the Myth of Codependency. And Sam, I finally allowed myself, with all due respect to the people who created codependence and as many people as been helped by it, I finally decided to stand up and say, it really is a myth. There's no fact behind it. There's no books behind it. There's just a lot of talk and opinions. And as therapists and professionals, we need to work from facts. And the fact is you're living with a troubled person, you love them, and it's going to hurt you, and you need support and love, not to be challenged or blamed.
I can't thank you enough for coming in for our audience, Dr. Rob. Thank you so much for your time today.
It's an honor. And thank you, Sam, for the work you're doing to help people learn and grow and come to peace with themselves. Appreciate it.
Thank you.